Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Vault Tales. This was written and narrated by Ben Daly, also known online as Daily Tactics. If you like what you hear, please be sure to review the podcast and follow along for more in the future. The Bloop Incident. James sniffed his nose and immediately regretted it. The rush of cold air instantly froze the plethora of boogers that was building up inside him. He placed his hands over his face and huffed hot air into them. His nose began to thaw, but just barely. It would have to do. The small tank-like vehicle that Janet was driving was coming to a stop beside the large glacier structure that they had spotted the day previously. Janet flipped off the sound system, and Dave Matthews Band's "Crash Into Me" cut off abruptly. "Thank God," Greg said from the back seat. "It's been a year, and that's still the only crap you'll play. I'm sorry you didn't think to make a mixtape before a 2-year-long Arctic expedition," Janet retorted with a snarl. The two of them had been at each other's throats practically the entire ride. Captain Wilson had warned James about their feuding before they'd left the icebreaker that morning. James could remember the coffee breath rant he'd gone on about crewmen needing a strong leader to prevent infighting. But James had simply shrugged him off. He didn't need the old geezer telling him how to lead his expedition. The three scientists hopped out of the snow cruiser and struggled through the snow to the large ice mass before them. "Looks like a giant massive ice turd," Greg remarked on the blurry chunk of ice in front of them. It was as tall as a 4-story building and had a strange, opaque darkness to it. "Another scientific marvel we've discovered out here," Janet chided. "At least it wasn't another mysterious flying penguin," Greg responded to her. "I told you not to bring that up again. If you don't believe me, then I don't want to hear a word about it from you. What are you gonna do? Sick your penguins on me?" The two began to bicker back and forth. James shook his head and walked up to the glacier. There was something different about it. He ran his hands over it, and some of the loose snow was knocked off the front. His mouth fell open. Behind the snow was roughly 3 inches of solid ice. It held within it a large metal sheet. James took in what was before him. His mind was racing. It could be a lost ship or a downed aircraft, maybe even a long-forgotten building. Whatever it was, it meant their research project in the Arctic was finally going to have even the slightest amount of intrigue. James excitedly ran his hand further across the front of the glacier, exposing more of the metal. After a few seconds, he came to a large metal door. It had a circular wheel on the front of it, similar to what you'd find on a submarine hatch. At this point, Janet and Greg had noticed what James was doing and had fallen quiet. He looked back at them and saw their shocked expressions. "Greg," James shouted, "go and get the blowtorch, and Janet, grab the radio out of the glove compartment." The two nodded their heads and ran off back to the Arctic crawler. James slowly turned back to the building before him. It had no right being here. This area of Antarctica was for the most part unexplored. In fact, his team had been assigned to traverse the region as a means of checking it off a list of unexplored land on Earth. James took a step back and exhaled. This could be the event that changed his entire career. James took a look at his watch. It had been 20 minutes since he'd radioed into the ship, but there was still no word back from Captain Wilson. He shook his head and put the radio into his pocket. He wasn't worried. The captain hardly took his job seriously, but he did want to get the ball rolling on reporting their discovery, which as of right now was being painstakingly melted before his eyes. Greg and Janet were taking turns using the blowtorch to melt off the ice from the door. They had already used 2 of their gas tanks, and were starting up on the 3rd. James glanced at his watch once again. It was almost 4 p.m. If they weren't back by 5, then the captain would surely try to communicate with them. Then, they could report their find. He just hoped that in reporting it first, he'd get to stay on the research team and research the building. He was only to be stationed here until 1998, leaving him less than a year left. Even less time if he was kicked off the research team. He didn't have time to worry further, as there was a sudden crack, and a small avalanche of ice and snow cascaded down towards Greg and Janet. They quickly jumped back, avoiding a potentially fatal accident. But nobody commented on it. Instead, the three of them stared at the door, all thinking the same thing. What was on the other side? Should we go in? Greg asked. We should wait for the ship's crew. They can bring guns. What do you think's on the other side? Bears? Quiet, you two. James snapped at the bickering. He thought for a minute. The radio would likely not get a signal inside the building, but there was really no sense in waiting. Nothing could be living within this ice sarcophagus. Greg, help me with the door. Greg sprang to his feet and put his gloved hands on the icy door wheel. James did the same, and with a count to 3, the two of them pulled. James strained hard against the heavy metal, but it did not budge. Stand back, Janet said after they'd let go of the wheel. She brought forward the blowtorch and unleashed a large jet of fire onto the door. She allowed the metal to glow red hot before stepping back once more. The cold Arctic air instantly extinguished the fiery metal. James and Greg resumed their positions and pulled. This time, the wheel slowly squeaked to life and turned. It took several spins for it to finally creak open the heavy metal door. The three researchers peered into the darkness of the glacier building. Inside appeared to be a long tunnel. It smelled of decay and mold. Nope. No way. There is no way that I'm going in there. Janet shook her head and crossed her arms. James looked at her. She wasn't being stubborn. She was scared. There was a concern in her blue eyes. I'm with her, boss. Greg's brown eyes showed fear as well. The formerly confident man was now running his hand into his dreadlocks and shaking his head in the direction of the dank corridor. Fine. James sighed. He knew he couldn't force them to go with him. It was not in their job description. But that didn't mean he wouldn't go himself. If anything, the tunnel had increased his curiosity in the situation. Go back to the cruiser. Wait at the radio. I'm just going to go check out the inside and see what this place is. I'll be back in an hour. The two of them tried to protest, telling him to wait for the crew to come. But his mind was made up. Eventually, they agreed, giving him their flashlights and food rations, just in case. Soon after, he was entering the tunnel. He was quickly absorbed by darkness. He turned around to his two companions and waved to them, as they watched him move further in. They gave him an uneasy nod, and he turned back to the tunnel. As he moved, he turned on the flashlight he had taped to his backpack strap, which illuminated the dark gray walls. The inside was strangely warm and humid. In fact, the floor, which James was used to being slick and icy inside the ship, was a thin layer of water here. James pressed forward into the darkness. It seemed as though he had been walking for at least a half an hour when he finally came to a dead end. At first, he was puzzled. Was this it? Was this some sort of weatherproof shelter set up and abandoned? He couldn't believe anyone would have the resources to build something so random in a place nobody ever ventured. But, as he scanned the dead end, he noticed faint outlines on the wall. This was the first time he'd seen anything of any sort on these gray walls. He moved closer and rubbed his hands across the outline. A thick layer of grime peeled away and revealed a symbol, one that he had grown up familiar with from his veteran father, the swastika. Its faded red lines seemed to glare at him, resonating evil and hatred. James shivered. He knew that there had been Nazi expeditions to Antarctica. In fact, he knew nearly every Antarctic expedition in history. And the German research vessel, the Schwabenland, had made landfall half a continent away from here. He stared at the swastika, stumped by its very existence. But he also noticed that there was another symbol, pressed into the very center of the vile mark. James leaned in for a better look. It was a sword and a lit torch, crossing over each other diagonally. James took off his gloves and felt the symbol. It wasn't just painted, it was engraved into the wall. He brushed it to clear the crack in the engraving, but as he did so, it gave way slightly. There was a lurch under his feet, and suddenly, James was falling. Outside the tunnel, Greg and Janet warmed themselves with the heating system of the tank-leg vehicle. Surrounding them, a flurry of snow was beginning to fall. It made a thin coat over the ice in which they had parked. As the vehicle sat there, the ice began to shift. Thin cracks formed in ancient frozen sheets. Then, the ice surrounding the vehicle fell, and with it went the vehicle, hurtling headfirst into the icy waters below. James felt his stomach give out from inside him, and retched across what seemed to be a small elevator that was taking him lower and lower into the glacier. He fell to the floor, trying to find something to hang onto to keep himself upright. The walls blurred past him, nothing separating himself from their exposed surfaces. He managed to get his feet underneath him and knelt above the elevator floor. His eyes felt like they were popping out of his head from how wide they were. But finally, the elevator began to slow and halted. As soon as his head stopped spinning, James could see that he was in front of another gray hallway, except now he guessed that he was a mile underground. Perhaps not even underground, but rather in the sea. He looked down the dark hallway, angling his lights onto the walls. This time, they were not bare. Instead, they had long tears in the metal, as if Wolverine had gotten loose in there. James reached to his hip and pulled out his 9mm pistol. He carried it with him to scare away any polar bears they encounter on the ice. It wouldn't do a lot of damage. That was left to the rifles on the ship, but it would at least offer some protection. He backed up into the corner of the elevator and reached over to the strange symbol on the swastika. He tried pressing it once more, but it did not budge. He tried again and again, but nothing. He quickly moved around with his flashlight, looking for anything that would get the elevator back up to the surface and safely to his team waiting for him. There was nothing. James felt his heartbeat begin to quicken. He looked back down the dark hallway. It was the only direction he could go. James slowly hugged the walls of the hallway and made his way forward. His flashlight glinted off the walls, illuminating dark crimson streaks. James hesitated. It looked chalky, like a liquid that had dried up long ago. He could put two and two together, but didn't want to think about it. Finally, he made it to the end of the hallway, which seemed to open up to a large room. He hesitated at the doorway, seeing a big electrical switch at the very edge. He gave it a hefty shove, and suddenly everything was as bright as the sun. He fell to his knees again, blinded by the sudden light. He waved around his gun ahead of him, threatening anything that may be coming his way. But nothing approached. His eyes slowly adjusted, and he stood up. He felt extremely vulnerable in this unknown space. His back felt compromised towards the elevator, and before him was an opening to a brightly lit room of unknown contents. But he figured there was only one way to feel secure, and that was to proceed forward. So he raised the 9mm up to eye level and swept around the corner into the room. Inside, the walls of the octagonal room were a stark contrast to the dark gray in the hallway. In here, they were hospital white, save for the frequent bloodstains splashed across them. In the center of the room, there were old tube monitors, with an array of buttons below them. Chairs were scattered around the room, tossed aside from whatever had disturbed this Nazi nest. But then, there were the Nazis themselves. An array of bodies were tossed everywhere throughout the room. Some of them were face first on monitors. Others were heaped into corners of the octagon. They had old machine guns and rifles still clutched in their skeletal hands, as if they had been backed into the edges of the room defensively. Strapped onto their faces were gas masks, but the filters on the front of all the masks had corroded away. This wasn't oxidization destroying the filters, as there wasn't any rust, but rather a dark green mold-like substance had spread across the front of the filters, as if the men breathing through them had attracted the mold to their mouths, and it had dissolved the masks. James zipped up his parka so the top of it was covering his own mouth. Then, he noticed the doorways. There were 3 of them around the room. Each was labeled at the top in German, but he had no idea what they said. All he knew was that each of them had metal pipes through the door handles and wooden planks nailed into the walls around the door. The Germans had gone through great trouble to keep whatever was inside of them. Each door was made of metal and had a small rectangular window at the top of them. James peered through the first one to his right, but it was completely dark inside. He was unable to make out anything. It was the same with the middle door, but the last door on his left had flashing lights inside. The power had managed to stay on ever so slightly in there. The light flashes were a dark green. He peered closer in, and saw with every flash that some sort of green mist was smothering the entirety of the room. He tried peering closer, but couldn't make anything out. It was so dense that the light had trouble illuminating anything through the mist. He turned to look away, when suddenly the corner of his eye caught a shadow moving across the green mist. He turned, hair raised on his neck, and stared intently through the small glass window. But if he had seen anything in there, it was no longer moving. James slowly backed away from the window, moving towards the computers in the center of the room. He figured that each one must have had a purpose, as they were all labeled with different symbols. One had a knife and a fork next to each other. Another had a simple triangle. The third had 2 horizontal bars with 4 vertical bars between them, like a jail cell. And the final symbol had an old-fashioned camera. James' heart leapt, and he quickly moved over to the monitor with the camera. He found a switch at the bottom of it and flipped it. The monitor came to life. It showed multiple small squares with different images on them. The middle one was of him, looking over the computer. It was security tapes. James was confused by this. He didn't think that this type of technology had existed during the time of World War II. But then again, this place had a high-speed elevator, multiple electronic computers, and working electricity. Maybe this facility wasn't belonging to the Third Reich, but the Fourth. He humored himself with the outlandishness of it all, and went back to the screens. The top 3 were all dark. The one to the left of the view of him was another angle of this room. The one to the right of him was completely black. Finally, the bottom 3 were of the elevator, as well as the 2 hallways that he had taken to get to the monitoring room. The image was extremely grainy, and of course in black and white, but he could still clearly make himself out. He had a thought that perhaps he could find the tapes of the last time the power was on in this room and see what had happened to these people. He began to tap on the different buttons below the monitor. At first, they had made the screen wobble and shake strangely, but finally, he pressed one that caused a screeching sound, followed by all 9 boxes lighting up brightly. He was looking at what he imagined was the beginning of this security tape's memory. There were men moving around the rooms, all of which wore German World War II helmets and uniforms, like the dead men on the ground around him. However, their faces appeared. They were not wearing the gas masks. The top 3 rooms were now visible as well. The one on the far right appeared to be some sort of mess hall, with the soldiers eating food at long tables. The middle was less obvious. It was a small room, with what seemed to be science equipment across large white tables. Men in lab coats moved around with clipboards and pencils, noting things and conversing with one another. The very last image on the top row was of an empty room. This was the room now filled with green mist. There were 8 guards in the room, with machine guns at their waists. They seemed to be standing before 4 doors. 2 guards were at each door, but that was all James could figure out. He began pressing buttons again, until he found what he thought to be the fast-forward button. It caused the screen to speed up, and the men on it moved like little ants in a colony, darting from workstation to workstation in quick succession. Then, the screen in the top middle went black. James hit the button again, and the video returned to normal speed. Every German soldier in the other rooms looked towards the room in the middle, as if some noise had gone off from there. The middle image slowly flickered back to life. In it, all of the scientists had seemed to be blown across the room. Their bodies now lay lifeless on the screen. The guards from the other rooms had run into the laboratory where they all stopped in their tracks. They seemed terrified by something that was now standing at the other end of the screen, out of view of the camera. The guards raised their guns and began to fire, but it didn't seem to be of much use, as the obscured thing was now coming into view. It appeared to float forward from some sort of rippling mirror. It was a large, shadowy, humanoid figure. The Germans continued to fire at it, but the bullets passed through it harmlessly. The Germans, still in the monitoring room, began closing the door and bringing forth nails and planks, barricading their fellow soldiers inside. As the entity began to close in on the Germans, they threw down their weapons and began to bang on the door behind them, begging to be let free. The entity looked up to the camera, right into the lens, right into James's soul. The camera went dark. James let out a breath that he had been holding in for minutes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. There was no way that any of it was real. It must have been some sort of elaborate hoax, or maybe he had fallen mentally ill aboard the ship during the long Arctic voyage, and this was all a hallucination. But then, he felt the cold steel of his pistol in his hand, and he knew that this was indeed real life. This was no dream. The face of the entity was still etched into his mind. He had only seen it for a second, but he knew he would remember it for the rest of his life. It was shadowy, and seemed to move in and out of focus, except for two unblinking white eyes. James looked back to the monitor. All of the Germans were now arming themselves and working on the barricades in the middle room. However, the monitor to the left no longer contained the guards, who had gone to investigate the laboratory. Now, shadowy tentacles began to swarm around the doorways they had been guarding. As quickly as they had appeared, they had gone. 4 large steel doors then swung open, and a mist seemed to spread from the rooms. That mist covered the lens, but James could still make out 4 large shadows that looked almost reptilian, moving out of the doors and into the empty room. The Germans in the monitoring room saw what was occurring and began to point towards the room in a panic, but it seemed to be too late. The mist had begun to spread into the monitoring room, and from there into the cafeteria and the hallway. All James could now see was the flash of gunfire and shadows running about. Then, all of the monitors went dark, and James was left in the monitoring room with nothing but his pistol in his hand and a screen that was dark. Bang! James' neck shot towards the door to his left, where a large object had been slammed into it. The green mist seemed to be moving on the other side. James leaned over the buttons below the monitor, with his pistol leveled at the door. More bangs seemed to be coming from the other side, with increasing intensity, but it still did not budge. James must have hit some buttons on the monitor, as the feed had returned to present day. He could see himself in the middle, but something else had changed. The elevator was no longer at his level. It was missing. James looked down the long hallway and confirmed it. He then looked back to the misty door and saw the old wood had begun to splinter in the middle that was barricading it closed. The researcher made a split-second decision and ran through the doorway to the hall and raced to where the elevator was now missing. He looked up the empty shaft and saw that it was indeed miles long. There was no way he would be able to climb his way to the top. Bang! 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 The noises from the misty door were increasing, and he heard at least one of the wooden beams snap broken. He prayed the others would hold their place, but his prayers went unanswered. Snap! Bang! The sound of wood splintering and the door flying off its hinges onto the floor could be heard down the hallway. James felt a hot liquid run down his snow pants into his boots. Whirr! A new noise was coming from overhead. James looked up and saw that the elevator was moving back down. He stepped aside to get out of its way and looked down the hallway. A green mist was now inching its way towards him with a large looming shadow in the middle of it. Every step the shadow took, the building shook. Whoosh! The elevator landed at the floor, and James swung himself around and his heart sank. There wasn't anybody in it. There was just a small electronic device sitting on the elevator's floor. It blinked, a red light on and off. James dove into the elevator all the same and grabbed at the device, hoping somebody had just sent him a weapon that he could use to save himself. He turned the cylindrical metal object over in his hands and managed to read the words on it. The nuclear option. There was a flash of light, so bright James could see the bones through his hands. Then, a heat so intense that he thought his skin was melting off of his bones. Boom! Hundreds of miles away, at a small fishing village off of Newfoundland, a team of sonar workers were monitoring whale migrations. Their fax machine lightly whirred to life and began printing out a sheet of paper. Roger, the technician of the facility, sipped his coffee while the biologist George read out the fax. It's from the UK. They're asking if we heard a bloop on our equipment, George said. A bloop? I guess so. Well, let me run back the machine. Roger then flipped a few buttons and played back the recordings from 5 minutes ago. The pair listened, amused by the change in pace of their research. Sure enough, after the eerie echo of the ocean sounded for a minute or two, an unmistakable bloop rang out. The two men looked at each other. Whatever had made that sound, for it to have been heard between two different sonar stations so far apart, had to have been monstrous. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Vault Tales. If you'd like to hear more, please be sure to let me know in the reviews and comment section. I appreciate you all listening, and be sure to let me know what you liked and didn't like about this episode.